Hey guys, Brett here at Motion Raceworks, and today we're going to go over shock travel sensors. Today we're going to go over measuring your car, choosing the correct length shock sensor, how to set it up in your ECU, and how to review the data once you've made a pass at the track. We have available 6 different length shock sensors. The shock sensors range from this 1.75 to 11 inches of extension. This little guy is used for transmission position sensor. You can get creative with these. You can literally use this to 0 to 5 volt sensor. So if you need to measure the distance of anything, basically you can set this up. We've sold them to guys on boats, different applications. But generally this little guy paired with our mount here is used on the side of the transmission for gear position. Then we move into our 3-inch sensor, our 6-inch sensor, 7-inch, 8-inch, and then the big boy, 11 inches. Depending on your suspension travel and your car, you're going to choose the sensor that fits in your range so the sizing stays compact and you have a usable range of data. These sensors can be used with any ECU or data logger. They provide a 0 to 5 volt signal that's attached to the distance that the sensors travel. It's a linear position sensor. They come unterminated, so you can choose this connector of your style if that's on your harness or if you need to wire it from scratch. We have multiple connectors available from the Race Pack Molecs to DTM connectors so you can pin out. All the instructions and calibration data for these sensors are on the website. They'll come with it, or you can scan the QR code here. We have a few different mounting options available. These mounts that we have currently are for a coilover type strut. This would go over to bolt to extend the sensor out depending on your car. The mounting for these sensors gets pretty custom car to car because every car is built different if it has like a factory style chassis or if it has a tubular style chassis. But these mounts are quick and easy for a straight coilover setup to use. The front mounting gets a little trickier again because every car is a little different. So you have to do weld-on tabs. Depending on the car builder, if you buy a chassis, they're going to have the tabs built on them. But if you're starting from scratch, you'll have to just kind of lay the sensor out to see where it's going to be and then weld and measure your tabs accordingly. Okay, so now we're going to show you what to look out for when choosing the right length shock sensor for your car and mounting it. There's really only a couple things to really look out for when mounting shock sensor. For one, you want the extension, your car at full extension to make sure that you're not going to overextend the sensor. You want to leave some sensor in the body to make sure that it doesn't damage the sensor. And then the same thing at ride height and then in compression. So you just want to make sure that you're not overextending or collapsing the sensor, causing damage to the sensor body. You want to try to mount the sensor as parallel as possible to the shock so there's no binding and it has a smooth travel up and down. We're underneath the rear of my car, which currently has a tab welded onto the top bar. And then I use our mount on the bottom of the coilover strut here, which will space the sensor out perfectly, and then we'll get our measurement. So now with the car's in the air, the rear end's at full extension, we'll take our measurement from the tab, mounting tab at the top to the mounting tab at the bottom. And we'll note down that measurement. On the website, each sensor length has the description of the fully extended and fully collapsed size. You won't have the sensor with you to try to size up, so you're going to have to go off your measurements. Got the fully extended measurement now, we note that down, and now we'll get a measurement at ride height, note that down, and then try to find the sensor that fits the best in that range. Now we have the car setting down on some wheel cribs, so it's at ride height and we can still get underneath it. We're going to take the same measurement from the top mount to the lower mount. And now we know our ride height measurement, and I know that this car has about 1 inch of compression available, so I'll factor that in to be my bottom number. So for my car, we chose the 8-inch sensor, and we're going to go ahead and install that. For this tab style mount, I use some washers here to space the heim joint off the tab. If this bolted up directly to that flat tab, it would eliminate any movement in the heim and it would cause the sensor to bind and possibly break. We want the heims to be able to move free. That's their job. So we space it off the mount and go ahead and bolt that up. We'll go ahead and attach this to our lower mount. Put a dab of Loctite on this bolt because we're tightening against plastic. And that's it. Okay, so there's a couple different ways to set up the shock sensor in your ECU. Depending on your ECU system, it may vary a little bit. If you go to the website on the shock sensors or scan the QR code, it will bring you to our instructions. On the instruction sheet, we have a table populated with multiple different cells with voltage range and travel position of the sensor. Today, I'm going to show you how I set it up on my Motec, doing kind of a custom table, which is available on most ECUs. This will give us the exact range of the shock. So the trouble with just using the blank generic table, 0 volts is 1 inch, and then 4.9 volts is 1 inch, basically wherever your sensor lands in between, you're not going to have like the exact reading of your suspension. You're just going to have a number that may not represent anything to you, and you'll have to do some math to figure out where it is. So what I like to do is to zero the sensor in my ECU at the car's ride height, and then measure how much travel the car has, and then set the top number to that exact extension. So when I'm reading my data on the data log, the car's sitting on the starting line, the shock sensor front and rear is reading 0. So that's my base point, 0 inches. Once the car leaves the starting line, now the sensor, the front end extends, the rear end extends or compresses. You're going to be able to see exactly where it is in the travel. 1 inch is 1 inch, 2 inches is 2 inches, and it's easier to interpolate the data after the fact like that. So we're going to go ahead and set that up now. The car right now is currently sitting at ride height. So I'm going to go in and look at the live voltage reading, enter that in as my 0 value. Then I'm going to raise the car up to full extension and then enter in that value as 6 inches, because I know that this car has 6 inches of travel. I've already measured it. So basically I'm going to have a 0 mark, a 6-inch mark, and then when I read my data log, it's going to be between those two. So I powered on the ECU. I'm in the left rear suspension position, which is my left rear shock travel sensor. Each corner will be done the same individually. We're going to go to the translation table here where it has our voltage reading converted to our inches. Right now we can see the live voltage of the sensor as it's sitting at ride height is 1.999. Okay, so we can basically, let's just call this 2 volts. 2 volts for this reading. 0.0, okay. And then now our translation to inches is going to be 0 inches. So now we see our shock sensor is reading 0 inches. And now we're going to go ahead and raise the car up and then see where our voltage level is. Enter that in and enter in our 6-inch number there, and then it'll translate between 0 and 6 inches. Okay, so now the rear end at full extension, we have 4.8. So we'll go into our table, set our high number as 4.8. And set our value for 6 inches. Save that. And now the ECU will interpolate between these two numbers in the background. Halfway would be 3 inches, 2 inches, 1 inches extension. So right now our rear left is at 6 inches because that's what we did it to. Lower it back down. Another thing to keep in mind, depending on your vehicle, is you want to have the driver in the car. Depending on how crucial and how exact you want this measurement, it may change 1/10 of an inch or so. But in general speaking, in terms on the data log, you're going to get an idea of what's happening there. Now we're going to go ahead and walk through the Haltech instructions. I won't be live on a Haltech car, but we can go through the software. It does it about the same way, but a little bit differently. Okay, so we have let's get back here on the left rear shock sensor, rear left. Okay, so now we're going to, in the Haltech, enter in our native RIFE sensor documentation, which we go to the documentation, 0.13 volts, 0 inches, and 4.9 volts is 8.2 inches. So 0.13 and 4.90. This was 0 inches, and this was 8.22 inches. Now what this is going to do is take the very bottom of the sensor, into the 0 inches, and the very top of the sensor, 8 inches. Now, like we were showing before, where you have your shock sensor position on your car, it may not be at the sensor's true 0 because you may not be using the full travel of the sensor. Now in the Haltech system, what this has is an offset. So now with the vehicle at ride height on the ground, we can go in here and calibrate our offset. So this will automatically 0 your ride height position. So when you're reviewing your data logs, you'll leave the starting line at 0 inches and then go up or down from there, and it'll be easy translatable data. So this is a data log pulled up of a 1/4 mile pass with shock sensors in place. The yellow lines are the rear shock sensors, the blue lines are the front shock sensors. You can see on the starting line we have a little bit of an offset reading between the two sensors, and you can see it gets a little worse down track. These should have been calibrated closer to each other so that way you can actually see if you have any twist or not in the car, which is the purpose of running 4 sensors all the way around. but we'll go right here. Race time is at 0, and then we'll start to run, and you can see basically what the suspension is doing. The car leaves the starting line, front end travels up to the travel limiter, and now the rear end is extending, getting through the run. Front end is starting to come down, rear end is starting to come down. By the finish line, the front end is actually in the negative and the rear end is closer to ride height. This is a pretty good example of a car that works well with some aero, and this is basically what you're going to look for. So in your car, you're going to use this data to tune your suspension in multiple different ways. In the past, you relied on a video from the side of the car. Maybe it got a good shot, maybe it didn't get a good shot. You really didn't know. Where this is really going to come into play is like if you have wheel spin or a wheelie, because basically you're going to take a timestamp on the log. You'll see where the tires spun, and your guy said, "Oh, the front end was too tight." But look, the front end was already up and doing its thing, so you know that the front end really wasn't affecting it as much as maybe you thought it was. So in here, you're going to get real-time shock data of what your car is doing on the racetrack to be able to make improvements and adjustments from there. When working with a lot of shock manufacturers, they're going to ask you inches per second. That's how they tune the shocks without being there. To figure that out, you're going to be able to do the math. You're going to be able to take your timestamp at a point, take your timestamp at another point, calculate how many inches it traveled throughout that second, and give them the information they need to help you tune your shocks. All right, so now we're going to move on to the front. Same principle applies in the front as in the back. You're going to measure your suspension fully extended, fully collapsed, get your measurement, and find the best sensor that fits in that for you. One thing to keep in mind with the front is if you run a travel limiter, make sure you do your extended measurement with the limiter disconnected. So that way, if you disconnect the limiter to work on the car, you don't have to disconnect your shock sensor, so it can go through the full suspension travel, collapse, and extend it without damaging the sensor. You want to, again, keep the sensor as parallel to the shock as you can. I know on some front ends this is a little difficult and you have to get the sensor angled. That's fine, it will work as long as there's no bind on it. You'll just lose a little resolution of the sensor as it won't have the full exact extension of the shock. So this car has a mounting point on the top. It has a tubular control arm on the bottom, which currently doesn't have a mounting point. So we'll have to do a little weld on tab onto him. We'll do our measurements from mount to mount, collapsed and extended, and pick the sensor that fits the best. Okay, so hopefully this video gives you a better understanding on how to measure, order, set up, and read shock sensor data. If you need any more information on these products, please feel free to reach out to our sales team or check out our website. We're constantly making new mount solutions for these sensors, so if you don't see something you need today, maybe to be on there next week, keep tuned in for that. And make sure you subscribe so next week you can see our new Tech Tip Tuesday.